Polynomials. Multiplying two binomials. When you multiply two binomials, you'll be using the distributive property, the product rule of exponents. And remember, the product rule of exponents is when you have like bases and you multiply them together, you're going to add their exponents. And then lastly, you're going to want to combine like terms. And like terms have the same variable with the same exponent. And to combine, you're going to add or subtract their coefficient, the number in front of the variable. Here's an example. We have in parentheses 2x plus 1, and then we have another parentheses of 7x minus 5. When you have two parentheses attached to each other, it is multiplication. To multiply these together, you're going to take that first term in the first parentheses and you're going to distribute it or multiply it to everything in the second parentheses. So you see here I'm going to have 2x times 7x. When you have 2x times 7x, you're going to multiply the numbers together and then you're going to multiply the like bases. And in here, that x variable has an exponent of 1. So when you multiply x to x, you're going to end up with an x squared. So here we end up with 14x squared. Now you're going to take that 2x and you're going to multiply it to the last term, which is that minus 5 or negative 5. You're going to have 2x times negative 5, and you're going to end up with a minus 10x. Now you need to take the second term in the first parentheses and distribute it to everything in the second parentheses. So you're taking that 1 and you're going to multiply it to that 7x, and you're going to be left with plus 7x. And then you're going to take that 1 and multiply it to that negative 5 or minus 5, and you're going to end up with a minus 5. So here is how you do the multiplication for when you have two binomials multiplied together. Now I always keep the multiplication part in gray because ideally you want to get to the point where you can do the multiplication in your head and simply go directly to what you would get. 2x times 7x would give you 14x squared. Now lastly, you always have to put your answer in simplest form, which means if you have like terms, you will need to combine them. So in this case, I do have like terms. Those two middle terms are like terms. They're the same variable with the same exponent. So I'm going to combine them. So in this case, I'm going to have a negative 10 plus 7. So you're going to end up subtracting and keeping the sign of the higher number. So this is going to end up being 14x squared minus 3x minus 7. So don't forget that last step of combining like terms. Pause and try. So you're going to distribute 9x times x is going to be 9x squared. 9x times positive 6 is going to be plus 54x. And now we're going to distribute that negative 5 or minus 5. So negative 5 times x is going to be a minus 5x. Negative 5 times positive 6. Negative times a positive is going to be a minus or a negative 30. Now you need to combine those like terms, and those like terms is a positive 54 minus 5. So you end up with 49x. Now this is a special case. Whenever you see an exponent, you need to know that that means that whatever that base is, it's being multiplied to itself that many times. So in this case, the base is a binomial. What that exponent means here is I'm multiplying that binomial to itself 2 times. So you end up having the 3x plus 1 times 3x plus 1. So it's a special case, and with special cases, make sure you remember that if a base is a binomial, you need to take that binomial, write it twice, and then multiply it out. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the previous example. We're going to take the first term, multiply it to the first term in the second parentheses. We get 9x squared. Then we're going to take the first term and multiply it to the last term. 3x times 1 is going to be plus 3x. And now we're going to take the second term and multiply it to the first term. So you get plus 3x, and then 1 times 1 is plus 1. Lastly, don't forget, if there's like terms, you will need to combine them. And in this case, I have 3x plus 3x is going to give me 6x. So our final answer here would be 9x squared plus 6x plus 1. Whenever we have this special case where it's a squared binomial, there's a shortcut to do this multiplication. Notice here that I labeled the first term as a. So when you have the first term of a squared binomial, the shortcut is to simply take the first term and square it, whatever the first term may be. And then the middle term will always be the two terms inside the binomial, inside the parentheses, multiplied together. So you have a times b, and then you have to double it. So that's where the 2 comes from. So your middle term will always be 2 times a times b, whatever's inside the parentheses. And the last term will always be the last term squared. And in this case, b, so it would be b squared. Let me show you the shortcut and how it works with numbers. So I'm saying here that the first term will be whatever the a value is squared. Now notice here the a value is 4x. It's whatever's in the first spot. So in this case, a is 4x. So I'm taking 4x and squaring it. You're not just taking the x, you're not just taking the 4, you're taking whatever's in the first spot. So the first spot is 4x, and I'm going to square it. So 4x squared would give you 16x squared. So remember, you got to square the number, and you got to square the variable. So it's going to be 16x squared. Now the middle term is always going to be the a times the b times 2. So a here is that 4x, and the b is 6. So you're going to take 2 and you're going to multiply it to 4x and the 6. So you have 2 times 4x, which is going to give you 8x, times 6, which is going to give you 48x. And then lastly, you're going to take the last term and square it. And in this case, the last term is 6. So you're going to take 6 and square it, and you're going to end up with plus 36. So this is the shortcut. To multiply quickly a squared binomial, you take the first term and square it. Take the two terms inside, multiply them together, and then double it. And you end up with the 48x. And then take the last term and square it. So the only difference when you have a squared binomial and you have a minus inside is that that middle term is going to be a minus. But everything else is still going to be positive. So that end number will be a plus. Because remember, when you multiply negative to a negative, you get a positive. So that's where that end term's coming from. So here's another example, but we have a minus. So remember, the first term squared. Your a value here is 2x. So you're going to square the whole thing. You're going to end up with 4x squared. Your middle term is always going to be 2 times the two terms inside multiplied together. So the middle term here is going to be 2 times 2x times 3. So remember, it's always going to be a minus for the middle term when you have a minus inside the binomial. So you're going to end up with 12x. And then last term, the last term is always going to be whatever the last term is squared, and always plus. So you're going to end up with a plus 9. Pause and try using the shortcut. Get the first term squared, which is 4x squared. 2x times 5 times 2 is going to give you 20, and it's minus because we have a minus in the binomial. And then the last term squared is 25. Or if you forget the shortcut, you could always just write it twice and then multiply it like two binomials. Pause and try. First term squared, 49x squared. 7x times 1 is 7. Doubled is going to be 14x. That's the middle term. Last term squared, 1 squared is 1. Or you can write it twice and multiply it through if you prefer. But it's important to try to learn the shortcut for higher level math. Here's the next special case. Now this is a special case. Notice here that the binomials kind of look the same, but one has a plus in it and one has a minus. So this is not a squared binomial. This is called the sum and difference. But when we multiply this out, we take 4x times 4x is going to give you a 16x squared. Then you take that 4x times that minus 1 or negative 1, and you get a negative 4x. I'm going to take that 1 and multiply it to the 4x. I'm going to get plus 4x. And 1 times a negative 1 is going to be a minus 1. Now notice here when I combine like terms, you're going to see that my middle term, a negative 4 plus 4, ends up with 0. So that means that I have no x variable. So I'm simply left with the 16x squared and the minus 1 when I combine like terms. So this is known as a special case where you don't have a middle term. Here is the rule. When you have the same thing in the first spot and the same thing in the second spot for the two binomials, the only difference is one has a plus and one has a minus. What you do as a shortcut is simply take the first term and square it. It's always minus and the last term and square it. So it's always minus and it's always just going to be two terms for this special case, the sum and difference of binomials. Here's an example. We have 3x in the first pot and we have 2 in the second and we have the plus and the minus. So this multiply this out quickly. You're going to take the first term and square it, always minus, and the last term and square it. So you're going to end up with 9x squared minus 4. Pause and try. First term squared minus the last term squared, you should have gotten 64x squared minus 16. Pause and try. First term squared minus the last term squared, x squared minus 25. So the next thing we're going to do is multiplying a binomial to a trinomial. Similar to binomial, we're going to be using the distributive property and the rule of multiplicating exponents. And lastly, if you need to simplify, you're going to need to combine like terms. So you always have to have your answer in simplest form. So if there's like terms that can be combined, make sure you check and combine them. We have here a binomial to a trinomial. And I'm going to take that binomial, that first term, and I'm going to multiply it to everything in the second parentheses. X times 2x squared is going to give you 2x to the third. X times 7x is going to give you plus 7x squared. And then x times 3 is going to give you plus 3x. And you also need to take that minus 1 or negative 1 and distribute it to everything in the parentheses. So you're going to have a negative 1 times a 2x squared, which is going to give you a negative 2x squared. Negative 1 times plus 7x is going to give you a minus 7x. And then negative 1 times a positive 3 will give you minus 3. The last step here is to make sure you combine like terms. You see here, I'm going to have to combine the x squares here. 7x squared minus 2x squared is going to give you 5x squared. And I'm going to combine the x's here. 3x minus 7x is going to give you a minus 4x. And then lastly, you're going to bring down that minus 3. So you multiplied a binomial to a trinomial. And lastly, make sure it's in simplest form by combining like terms. Pause and try. You should have gotten x to the third minus 4x squared plus x. and then 9x squared minus 36x plus 9. Once you've done the multiplication, make sure you combine the like terms here. A minus 4x squared plus 9x squared will give you 5x squared, and then x, which really has a coefficient of 1, minus 36 is going to be a minus 35x. For this next one, notice here that the trinomial comes first and the binomial comes second. What I like to do when I see something like that is just simply rewrite it so the binomial is first. Now it doesn't matter, but what you would be doing is taking the trinomial and each term multiplying it to everything to the binomial. It doesn't matter if you switch it around, it's up to you when you do this. So pause and try this. So you're going to end up with the first term is going to be 14x to the 5th minus 10x to the 4th plus 6x to the 3rd minus 21x squared minus 15x minus 9. Now notice here, when you go to try to combine like terms, there's nothing to combine. So that would be your final answer. This next part, we're going to do dividing polynomials by a monomial. So whenever you're dividing polynomials by a monomial, we're going to be using that quotient rule. And how the quotient rule for exponents work is when you have like variables being divided, you need to subtract their exponents. Subtract their exponents and leave where the higher exponent is. So when you have a polynomial being divided by a monomial, I like to separate it so that it's in 3 separate problems and simplify piece by piece, because that 5x is going into the entire polynomial. So you want to make sure that you're simplifying each piece by what it's being divided by. So when you separate it, you can see what needs to be simplified. So if I look at the first piece here, I'm simplifying the 10 divided by 5. 10 divided by 5 is simple division, and you're going to be left with 2. And then you're going to look at the next piece and remember the rules of exponents. You need to subtract their exponents and leave it where the higher exponent is. And the higher exponents on top, we have x to the 3rd over x. And x really has an exponent of 1. So when you subtract, you're going to end up with 2x squared. Let's look at the next piece. We have 5 divided by 5, which is going to end up being a minus 1. And then you have x squared over x. When you subtract their exponents, you're going to end up with x to the 1 power. And remember, you can't leave an exponent of 1 and you can't leave a coefficient of 1. So when you simplify this piece, you're simply going to be left with minus x. And then we're going to look at the last piece here, and you see 20 divided by 5 is going to give you 4. And then x divided by x, well, that's simply going to cancel out. X over x equals 1. So we don't need it here because we have the 4 left. So we're going to have plus 4 on the end. Pause and try. So you're going to break it out into 3 separate problems and simplify piece by piece. 18 divided by 6 is 3. When I simplify here, I'm going to end up with x squared. And then you're going to be reducing here. 12 divided by 6 is going to give you a minus 2. X squared divided by x is going to give you x. So you're left with minus 2x. And then lastly, 30 divided by 6 is 5. And then x is going to cancel out here. So your final answer here will be 3x squared minus 2x plus 5.